Hi, I'm Ben, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to wrap up January, but I do have to start with a confession because I have still not reviewed a load of books that I read in November and December last year. To be honest, things just got away from me, and there were a few weeks during that time when I just was too busy and didn't have that much time to reflect on my reading and put my thoughts into a coherent review. I have ended up with like this massive backlog of books that I have not reviewed. I think there's like 15 or 16 books that I still haven't told you about. I don't really know what to do about that. There's a voice in the back of my brain, a little voice that sounds a bit like me but slightly more annoying, that wants the channel to be this complete record of all my reading. But another part of me thinks that some of those books are now just lost to the annals of time and I will never ever catch up. There are definitely books in that mix that I want to talk about though, because there's some really interesting stuff in there, like Frankenstein. Milkman by Anna Burns is one of those books. All Fours by Miranda July is one that lots of people have been reading and talking about. And even one of my favourite reads of the year, which was What I Know About You by Eric Shakur. Do let me know in the comments what you would like to see. I could just maybe like pick my favourites, the ones I really want to have something to say about and share my reviews of those and just forget about the rest. But I don't know, something about that feels quite incomplete to me. Anyway, that was a whole rabbit hole about books that I am not going to talk about or discuss in this video. So let's talk about January. I hope you've all had a really nice start to the year. It's been a real mixed bag for me, not in terms of reading, just in terms of like my life. I've been more ill than usual. I've got this really irritating issue with my sinuses that I think comes through in my speaking voice, actually, because I sound quite nasal, and I sound more nasal when I'm ill. But on the other hand, I've also done some really nice things and spent some nice time with family and friends. Work has been super busy, but it's also been quite rewarding work, so I'm reasonably happy with what I've been up to. And I have to say, it's been a very good start to the reading year. I've already dished out 5-star ratings to 4 books. 2 of those 5-star reads are ones I've already talked about, along with 3 other books, because I did this 5 books in 5 days reading vlog right at the start of the year. And if you have not already seen that, I will link it down in the description, because I'm really happy with how nicely that video came together. I had some really nice days out, and in particular there was like a day trip we did to Oxford, and I think the footage from that is really beautiful. So it's worth like grabbing a cup of tea and watching that. I am considering doing a little bit more vlogging this year, so do let me know if that is something you would be interested in seeing on the channel. In total in January though, I read 12 books, which I know seems kind of counter to my stated goal of reading fewer books. But I haven't done that without intention, because my plan is that those books are read, those points are on the board, and as a result, all of the reading trackers on like Goodreads and the Storygraph, they're not going to be shouting at me for being behind anytime soon. So I can take my sweet time with what I'm reading from now on. Because I've already talked about 5 of the books that I did read in that vlog I mentioned, I've got 7 books to review for you today. And then after those reviews, I thought it'd be fun to do a bit of a goals and challenges check-in, so do stick around for that. Okay, I think that's enough intro waffle. So let's get into the first book that I'm going to review today, which is a booktube favourite, and it is a Bookstagram blinder, and it is also a Booker shortlistee, because friends, I have finally read Elena Knows by Claudia Piñeiro. And you know what? I bloody loved it. Piñeiro is an Argentinian author, and this was translated from Spanish by Francis Riddle. And I read it for 2 reasons. First, we picked it for my in-person book club that I have with a few of my friends. And I also did it as a buddy read with the king of vlogging himself, Nathan from Nathan's Nook, who, if you are not following, you should go and hit subscribe on his channel. Not right yet, you can finish watching my review first, but do go and do it afterwards. I will link to his channel in the description. In many ways though, I think my enjoyment of this novel has really been enhanced because I've benefited from all of these other really smart readers, and the discussions we've had about the book have been just really fascinating. This is about an older lady called Elena whose adult daughter Rita has been found dead in her local church. Everyone seems to have accepted that Rita took her own life, but Elena knows that there's something more to it. Something is up, because on the day it happened, it was raining, and she knows that Rita would never go near the church on a rainy day for her own specific reasons. So the story is all about Elena trying to uncover the truth. But the challenge she has is that she is suffering from Parkinson's disease, and it has made it very difficult for her to control her body. She is stooped, her vision is limited, and she isn't able to go anywhere in a hurry. You can already see how some of the thematic layers are starting to build up here. We're dealing with mother-daughter relationships, grief for the loss of a child, aging, disability, and there are even more because it also looks at church and faith and a woman's right to choose, how demeaning the administration behind medical insurance can be. And it's just such an accomplishment because it does all of this and it does it justice in a very short amount of pages. It is maybe slightly longer than it looks because although it's under 200 pages, it is written in this kind of stream of consciousness style. And so you get a lot of pages without many paragraph breaks. I have to admit that's normally something that I find quite challenging to read, but it's done so well here. It works brilliantly to be stuck in Elena's head, just the same way that her illness traps her in her own head. The prose here thrums with life, it has so much character, and Elena is in many ways quite an unlikable person, as is Rita actually in the scenes we see before her death. And that in itself is super interesting because Elena is grieving and she's very unwell, and Rita is dead and therefore naturally the subject of our sympathy. But they argue and they're mean, they aim to wound each other, and they uphold norms that strip women of agency. And yet, I just loved reading about them. Although I should qualify that I say I loved it, but some things here are quite emotionally difficult to read. I personally found it really difficult to read some of the descriptions of just physically struggling to do things with Parkinson's. There's this moment where Elena's trying to put on a coat. It's a really simple moment, but she can't get her arm in the armhole. It's so low stakes, but it is almost panic-inducing. But yeah, this book has everything. It has biting political commentary, it has twists and turns, it has melodrama and humour and misery, just the whole gamut. I could probably go on about this for another 20 minutes because I absolutely adored it, but I will leave it there and you should discover this all by yourself if you have not yet had the joy of reading it. I'm definitely excited to read more of Piñeiro's work, and I do already have a little luck waiting for me on my shelves. So yes, a fab start, and thank you to Nathan's Nook for buddying with me because I might not have read this quite yet if it wasn't for that buddy read. Next up, I had a library reservation come in, and our library borrowing periods are pretty short, so I had to prioritise this book, which is Birding by Rose Ruane. This is a contemporary novel set in a rundown seaside town in the UK, which has these dual issues of being stuck in the past, but also facing the threat of gentrification. Quite cleverly, which I have only actually just realised in reviewing the book, it has these two points of view, and in each of them there are these secondary characters that kind of personify these problems that face the town. I don't even know if I'm making sense, so let me explain. So one perspective is a woman called Joyce, and the main secondary character is her mother, Betty. They have lived in the town for a very long time, and their family used to be a significant part of the community, but they have since fallen on hard times. And they have this really kooky dynamic where they dress like it's the 1960s or 1950s or something, and despite them being mother and daughter, they also dress like they're twins. And I think the mother, Betty, represents the faded grandeur of the town. I don't know if anyone will be familiar with the old BBC sitcom Keeping Up Appearances, but Betty really brought to mind for me Hyacinth Bucket, or as she likes to pronounce it, Hyacinth Bouquet, because she's all like airs and graces. She's always trying to be proper and getting outraged about bad manners or inappropriate language. And it is quite amusing, although at times it's quite toxic as well. So that made her quite an interesting character to read. The mother and daughter characters do start out kind of caricaturish, but I think over the course of the book there's some good character development, and you do probably come to care about them more than the other perspective. And this other perspective is Lydia, who is a woman in her 30s who was a teen pop star in the 90s, and she comes to the town to get away from stuff in her past that has been dredged up. And she comes to stay with her former bandmate Pandora, who has bought this old hotel with an eye on doing it up. And so I think Pandora represents the gentrification side of things. So I did quite like the setup of this, a one-hit wonder pop star and a strange mother-daughter faded grandeur thing going on. And the opening of the book set in the scene of the town, I think that was really effective. Sadly though, the book fell quite flat for me, and it was largely because of the writing. This book, especially near the start, is just dripping in metaphor and simile, which is fine when that stuff is really good, but I found it pretty basic. I feel bad saying this because I can't quite put my finger on what made these metaphors not quite work for me. Like, I don't have an English degree or anything, but it was like being in the uncanny valley of metaphors. They were very close to being good metaphors, having some beauty about them, but they weren't quite close enough, and so it frequently just completely took me out of the narrative. As an example, like in the space of 10 pages, there was something that was likened to a flickering television, and then another thing was likened to a radio going in and out of tune, and I just didn't find it very interesting or beautiful. It felt like something that I could have come up with when I was doing my English A-level. There are some attempts made at beauty which fell flat for me as well because they were so on the nose. There's this part where one of the characters is bird watching and there's this Arctic tern that's like flying free to symbolize freedom. She also looks in another direction and there are these male ducks hassling a female duck to represent the Me Too movement. It just did not work for me. My final problem with the book was just the relationships and how they to me were not believable at all. They were all very weird people in different ways, and I could not for the life of me see how any of them liked each other, let alone loved each other. We talk a lot about how men write women pretty poorly, but in this book, the writing of the men was so not good. There is not a single man here who I would have believed as a character, and for one in particular, he's painted as a villain, but whatever it is that he did, which we are led to believe is some sexual assault or misusing his position of power, it's kind of left unsaid and kept as a mystery. Now, I don't need everyone's suffering explicitly laid out on the page, but something about how this situation was handled and used here just felt a little bit icky. I don't think it was intended to be a mystery and there wasn't supposed to be a denouement, but not naming it made it feel like one, and that just felt a bit crass to me. Overall, not one I really enjoyed, but in its favour, it does have a cat named Car Wash, which is quite fun. Right, the next book that I read was Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. This is a very hefty title at nearly 600 pages, and it brings together 3 storylines across the past, the present, and the future. In the past, we've got this story of 2 children caught up in the siege of Constantinople in like the mid 1400s. This bit actually feels very similar to All the Light We Cannot See because we've got these 2 young people on either side of a conflict, and one of them has a disability. So in All the Light We Cannot See, the young girl is blind, and in this one, the young boy has a cleft palate, and we jump between the 2 perspectives as they come closer and closer to their paths crossing. In the present day storyline, there's a young man who attempts to plant a bomb in a library, but unbeknownst to him, there is a children's play rehearsal going on upstairs. And in the future, humans have left Earth and boarded a ship that is aiming for this other rocky exoplanet that they aim to colonize and call home. The thread that connects the 3 stories is this ancient manuscript, lost but for the disparate efforts of different people over time to preserve it. This book, man, it is so good. It felt like a greatest hits in novel form because it really successfully, across those 3 storylines, tackles historical fiction, contemporary literary fiction, and science fiction. It's kind of magic how it weaves between them, and it uses that manuscript so effectively where there's like a character in one timeline will have an interaction with it, and then we'll read a short extract from it, and then pick up with another character in another timeline who has had a different interaction with the same bit of the text. It just flows so beautifully. And despite the length of the book, the pace is really fast. There's lots of short chapters. I think most are like 3 to 5 pages, and you'll be hard pressed to find many chapters that are 10 pages or more, which I find always read faster for me because it's easier to just say one more chapter and keep on going. The writing is also quite propulsive because this is written in the present tense that gives it a real sense of urgency. And Doerr does this thing actually, which he did in All the Light We Cannot See as well, where he counts things out in a way that adds a lot of pace. Something like, she walked down the corridor, 1 step, 2 step, 3. I really liked that. I think it added a bit of rhythm to the prose. I know some people don't love the present tense or the breathlessness of it, but I think it works really well here, and it's paired with lots of very beautiful sentences as well. Each timeline has 2 characters, except the future one has 1 character. All of the characters are really well developed. There were no perspectives where I just wanted to like get past their sections and get back to the other more interesting character. So I was very happy to read them all. And all the secondary characters, they're very well developed as well. I remember quite a lot of them. Like many books that we read, I'm sure a lot of secondary characters just fade away into the background. But here, there are lots that I do remember. And in particular, there's lots of memorable animal characters. I never knew that I would care that much about oxen, but here we are. They nearly made me cry. At the end of the book, and I won't say anything substantive about what happens, I will just say that things do come together in a meaningful way that is very satisfying. The thing is, I don't think the success of the novel hinges on that ending, because although things are revealed, the book doesn't depend on mystery, and the ending just caps off the story brilliantly rather than makes it what it is. And you know what? I just loved the book. Like, I really, really loved it. I could probably speak more on it, but there is just so much delight to uncover in your own reading of it. Because at heart, this is a love letter to books and libraries and preservation of stories. So if you've not read this yet, I would highly encourage you to do so. And I'd say particularly if you are a fan of like The Overstory by Richard Powers, or even like his more recent one, Playground, this covers a lot of the same ground. There's lots of stuff around the natural world and preserving Earth and trying to save ourselves as a species. So I just think it's terrific. I really would recommend reading it. Next up then, I read The Gathering by Anne Enright. And I read this as part of my aim to read more previous winners of the Booker Prize. It also very handily fits the prompt for the Read Good Challenge for January, which was annuary, to read a book by an author called Anne. This one won the Booker in 2007. And although I'd heard very good things about it, I headed into it with a little bit of hesitation. I was unsure about it because last year I read The Wren, and while I found the writing very technically beautiful, I just didn't connect with it. I found it a bit sterile and a little bit boring. Like The Wren, this is a contemplative drama about an Irish family, and the narrator of it is a woman called Veronica. She's one of the many grown-up children in the Hegarty family. She has just received news that her brother Liam, the sibling closest to her in age, has been found dead in England, and it becomes her responsibility to go to England, bring back his body, organise the wake, and that's the gathering of the title. We go along with Veronica on this journey, and as we do so, she recounts her memories, and they're memories that are both real and imagined about her family history and her growing up. She also tells us a bit about, or rather like quite a lot, maybe too much, about her marriage and the state that it's in, which is, it's fair to say, not looking good. She and her husband have this perfunctory coexistence. They sleep apart and actually operate almost on completely different schedules. She goes to bed just as he's getting up, and it's not, I guess, the most loving relationship I have ever read. Her narration is really interesting because it romanticizes things quite a lot, but it's also very unsentimental. She's pretty frank in how she sees things. And unfortunately, the way that she sees things is often through a very sexual lens. It's not without good reason thematically as the book reveals itself, but I can't express how tired I became reading yet another description of genitals. There is just so much of it, and particularly in the first half of the book. Even without that though, I would say I struggled once again to connect with Enright's book. I didn't find Veronica to be that sympathetic a character, and although I was quite invested in the storyline relating to Liam and what happened to him, the problem was it moves very slowly because we keep jumping back to these imagined scenarios between her grandfather and her grandmother. I was much more engaged with the latter parts of the book where those grandparent stories kind of fell away a little bit and we more focused on the present day of the book and the family come together for the wake and we see all those like interesting dynamics play out. I found that really entertaining. It was also helped by the fact that when I started to flag with the book, I listened to some of the audio while I was reading, and it is read by Anne Enright herself. And I knew that she is a really good narrator because she narrated The Wren. I did that entirely on audio. And she just brings so much life to the voices that is really, really good. I think the book does lean into some cliches about Irish families, but leaning in here is a very active property of Enright's writing because she does it quite knowingly. I can't remember the exact wording, but there's one point where she basically says, oh, in an Irish family, there's always a drunk, there's always this type of person, there's always that type of person. So I have to accept that it's something she was playing on. In the end, I don't think this one was for me, and I think perhaps Enright's writing just isn't my cup of tea. I can see why some people think it's brilliant, it's very technically well constructed. I just didn't really enjoy it. Okay, next we have The Gallopers by Jon Ransom. This is Ransom's second novel and very recently won the Polari Prize for Best Novel, coming hot off the heels of winning the Polari Prize for the Best Debut Novel last year for The Whale Tattoo. So 2 in 2. That's a pretty good batting average from him. Describing this book is really interesting because I think the marketing misrepresents it slightly and not really to its benefit, which is kind of funny because the next book I'm going to talk about also suffers from this problem, so marketing teams, I need you to sort your shit out. Let me explain what I mean. So this book claims to be a novel that spans 30 years from the 50s to the 80s and grapples with the AIDS crisis, and it makes it feel like you are going to be reading some sweeping gay history. And the truth is, you are not at all. This book is set over the course of about 1 year between 1953 and 54. It takes place in Norfolk and follows this boy in his late teens called Eli, who is gay but conceals that fact given the time period, although he does describe himself as having a sissy voice or a very feminine voice, and therefore, although he is hiding it, it's very obvious to those around him what he is. He lives with his aunt, and they are still coming to terms with the fact that a year earlier there was this devastating flood that basically ruined their entire hometown. And although by some miracle their field and their home was spared, unlike everyone else in the towns, Eli's mother was swept away and died in the flood. Eli's life then is turned upside down by a man called Jimmy Smart, who comes to stay in this livable shed on their land. I think it's called like the Black Shed or something. Jimmy is this rugged guy. He is rough and he's worked at the fair turning the Gallopers or the carousel, and Eli becomes quite infatuated, and the book is basically the story of what happens. The book is structured in this really interesting way. So you have these intense, beautiful descriptions from Eli's point of view, which I found very poetic, but actually written in quite spare and straightforward language. And each of these sections, which are not even a page long most of the time, they just build up to a conversation that is completely unadorned. No quotation marks, no he said, she said. You don't know exactly who is talking except by like intuition, by figuring it out. And I don't think it's that hard to figure out. But yeah, it's just line by line what is being said out loud. And what this gives you is just this back and forth, this like seesaw between prose and dialogue that I found worked extremely well for me. It was a really nice rhythm. It was like alternating between sweet and savoury foods, like heightening the pleasure of each because of its juxtaposition to the other. However, in the middle of the book, there is a section which is the script of a play. And this is dated as being from the 80s, and it's authored by Eli. And it features a lot of the character names we have heard before, but their roles and relationships are all mixed up. And if you read this bit thinking it is supposed to be directly continuing the story because you expected this sweeping narrative, because that's what the blurb told you, then I think you're going to be really confused and potentially very disappointed. Instead, I like to think of this as a bit of a puzzle to work out, and I haven't fully figured it out, but I've really enjoyed trying to think about it. I think it gives us some clues about what happens to Eli after the events of the novel and feels very open to interpretation. Its only critical function for the 1950s story is that it explains like one thing about Eli's family's land that you need to know for the next bit to make sense. But other than that, you could probably just ignore that this part is even in the book and still have a very good time with it. I did go into this thinking that it might be a novel that was all vibes, no plot, but there definitely is plot. There are twists and turns, and it really held my attention. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I think I am going to be ruminating on it and thinking about it for a long time to come. Then I read The Wedding People by Alison Esbach, and I'd seen this popping up on social media quite a lot, but it didn't seem massively like my kind of thing. But I did decide to read this book because Lena Knows told me to. It was one of her top reads of the year, and in describing it, she made this very good point about how the book has been marketed, which I definitely agree with. Basically, the synopsis you'll read of The Wedding People somewhat misrepresents, or rather like omits, a really important aspect of the story, and it is an aspect that is dealt with almost like immediately, so I don't think it's a spoiler to say what it is, but it is quite serious, and I feel like it's important to know going into the novel. And it is that the main character, a woman called Phoebe, has just gone through this divorce. She heads to a fancy hotel and she books its most expensive room for one night because she intends to end her life there. And it's that last bit about her intentions, which is nowhere to be seen in the book's description, at least online when I have checked. And I'm not really sure why. I do wonder if the publisher thinks it's going to put people off, but I also think if it is likely to put you off, then it's likely to put you off on page 1, or whichever page it is that that pops up on. But it is very early in the book, so I don't know why you would do that to your readers. Anyway, when Phoebe arrives, it turns out that every single other person at the hotel is there for a wedding, and she bumps into the bride-to-be called Lila in the lift, and for some reason she feels very compelled to be honest and share her plan. Lila, understandably, not very delighted by this because she thinks it's going to ruin her wedding, and so she tries to stop it happening. And as a result of that, Phoebe becomes involved in the wedding and awkward situations occur and hilarity and comedy ensue. Early on, I have to admit that I was not really digging it. The setup felt a little contrived and the dialogue a bit unnatural. There is this bit where Phoebe, given her nihilistic feeling about life, she decides to smoke on her hotel room balcony, and Lila's like, "Oh, you can't do that." And then Phoebe's response is to just explain the etymology of the word balcony to somehow prove that it's not technically part of the hotel room, and it just made no sense. I don't think hotel policy would give two shits about that reasoning. But then Lila was like, "Oh my god, you're really clever," and I just thought, what is going on here? I was definitely not on side at this point. But having said that, as the story progressed, I think it really finds its stride, and there's this moment maybe like 40% in, not quite halfway, there's a little mini twist where I was like, you have really got me there. And I was pleasantly surprised to have been deceived. It wasn't like this big game-changing twist or anything. I was just impressed at how that moment had been crafted. And then I think I became quite comfortable with the characters, and I saw that it's actually this very insightful novel about loneliness. Phoebe is the centre of the novel, a very obvious embodiment of loneliness because she has no remaining family, her husband has left her. But Lila, at her own wedding, is another person who is very lonely in just a very different way. She is surrounded by her family and friends at her wedding, but she is not able to be herself and she feels very trapped. And I found it very sweet how this friendship emerged between the two as they kind of bridged their loneliness and created a little mini community between the two of them. I'd say I found it a very pleasant experience overall. I listened to it on audio and it was very nicely narrated. It kept me entertained and amused while I was out walking. But it wasn't without its problems, and there are two main ones that I think dragged the book down a bit. First, I can't really explain in great detail without spoilers, which I'm not going to give you, so don't worry. But the way the plot works, everything is almost too neat. All of the characters felt like little jigsaw pieces where you can see exactly how they are supposed to fit together and what their purpose is. But real life just isn't like that, and so it felt to me quite unrealistic. My second problem is that Phoebe spends her entire time basically just acting like a therapist to the other characters. She flits around from person to person, but she is very passive. She will strike up a conversation, listen to the other characters' problems, and then just interject now and again to go, "Why do you think that? Why do you feel that way?" And once I noticed this pattern, it just really annoyed me. On the other hand, one thing I did like is that Phoebe is an academic of Victorian literature, and I quite liked how some of that was threaded in thematically to the story. So, for instance, she reads at one point Mrs. Dalloway, and she's thinking about it quite a lot. And you pick up how Clarissa Dalloway organising and preparing for her party really chimes with Lila trying to keep a grip on the planning of her wedding. I thought that was really smart. Overall, I think it's a mixed bag for me, but I landed on the side of enjoying it more than not. And if you're looking for a bit of frothy escapism with some serious undertones, then I think this might be a good book for you. Finally, this month, I read Cassandra at the Wedding by Dorothy Baker. This was originally published in 1962, but has relatively recently been reissued by Daunt Books in this lovely edition. I think the cover is real stunning. I read this one for the January prompt of the Savidge Reading Challenge run by Simon and Louise Savidge, and the prompt was to read a book with twins as the main characters. I have to say, I was very tempted to be cheeky and use The Gathering or The Gallopers, because both of those feature twins as background characters. But you know what? I decided if I'm going to do the challenge, I'm going to do it right. And I saw that someone had added this to the story graph, and I thought, great, that is on my shelves. It's not too long. I'm going to read it. And I am very glad that I did, because I thought this book was pretty brilliant. It was very close to 5 stars for me, but I gave it my first ever 4.5 stars. New year, new me. This one is about a woman in her early 20s called Cassandra, and she is traveling from her apartment in Berkeley to her family's ranch in California to attend the wedding of her twin sister Judith. What we learn is that until recently, when Judith went to live short-term in New York, the two women were inseparable. They were two parts of the same whole, and it's kind of expressed in a metaphor where they've bought this piano together and they each own half of it, and it really symbolises their oneness. But while Judith was on her own, she met a man that she wants to marry. But in the meantime, when Cassandra's been on her own, she's become a little lost and a little self-destructive. Cassandra is not a likeable character at all. She is self-centered, she is selfish, she is neurotic and overpowering. And while I can't say I would necessarily want to hang out with her, man, I enjoyed reading her so much. There is something about her character that felt very true and something that was very sympathetic despite her flaws. The core of this book is basically the character interactions, the conversational rallies between Cassandra and Judith and their father, who is a retired academic, and their grandmother, and a few other characters who come to the ranch at different times. Cassandra is very sharp and quick-witted and funny, but almost to a frustrating extent where it's hard to break through to her real feelings underneath. She's like that annoying friend who will hop on anything you say by mistake, and like make fun of that or answer a very simple question with a sarcastic quip. As an example, near the start of the novel, she just repeatedly and purposefully refuses to get Judith's fiance's name right. It's very funny to read, but it would be very annoying in person. And I think it's the strength of all of these conversations that the characters have, and the characters themselves, that really hold the novel up. It's entertaining, but also just under the surface is doubt and anxiety. We're watching someone try and protect themselves and control a life that's changing, one that seems to have gotten away from them. There was something about this that felt to me quite reminiscent, at least thematically, with Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. It has this kind of same mixture of misery and black comedy and touches on very similar themes of womanhood and connection. I think it's very interesting that it was published just a year before The Bell Jar, and there must have been something in the water at that time that was making women write some really remarkable books. So yeah, I thought this was excellent. I was very pleased to have read it. So that concludes my reviews for this video, but we're not quite done yet, because I thought it might be quite nice to do a little bit of a goals and challenge check-in at the end of each wrap-up, because I know a few people were quite keen to see a bit more content about the Read Good challenge. I know last year I just basically put the challenge out there and then didn't talk about it at all for the entire year, but it might be nice to see how all of my reading goals are going, not just the Read Good challenge, see if I delivered on what I was aiming to, or if I didn't in the current month, and then look ahead to the next month. So let's do that. I've got a little list here of things I am tracking. So first up, the Read Good challenge. January's prompt was Annuary, and I met that by reading The Gathering by Anne Enright. For February, it's Flamuary, and I'm actually torn between two books at the moment. So one that I mentioned in the Read Good Challenge video was Three Fires by Denise Mina, because I loved Rizzio so much, and this is another short little, I expect, corker from her. But I am also considering a new release that I'm very excited about and mentioned in my most anticipated releases video, which is Earth by Deborah Tompkins. Because this sounds right up my street. It sounds like it does some of the same things as Orbital and Cloud Cuckoo Land. I really love the cover as well, despite the sadness of seeing the Earth burn. It's like looking at the news. Then for the Savidge reading challenge, for January I had to read something with twins as the main characters, which I met with Cassandra at the wedding. And for February, you have to read a book with a body of water in the title, so like river or lake or sea, and that's what I'm going to go for, because I'm going to read John Banville's The Sea, and that's locked in. That is happening. I suppose bringing together two of the books that I've already mentioned, I am trying to read one Booker Prize winner every month, and so in January I achieved that with The Gathering, and in February The Sea also won the Booker Prize, so I'm going to be checking that one off, which is great. Big books. One of my stated goals was to read big books, and I achieved that in January by reading Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is 579 pages. I am also imminently, I say imminently, I've got 200 pages left to go, but I'm currently reading Juice by Tim Winton, which I'm going to get. I am reading Juice by Tim Winton, which is another chunkster. I think it's like 510-ish pages. I have 200 pages left and it's already overdue at the library, so I'm very sorry to whoever has this reserved. I'm trying my best and I will get it to you very soon. I also wanted to read more classics. And I didn't like put a number on this. I didn't have like I want to read one per month. I just wanted to read more. I suppose I could make a case that Cassandra at the Wedding is a classic. That is quite an old book now. It's like 65, 70 years old. But yeah, maybe I didn't check that off. And I don't have one planned for February. I'm just not going to have the time to read a classic because there's a bunch of other stuff that I also need to read. So we will make sure, I think, to schedule one for March. Oh, there is one more thing that I'm doing. I decided to participate in Sarah at Freshly Read Books TBR spin. And so I put together a stack of 12 books, which I probably need to get on wheels somehow. But they're these ones, plus Cloud Cuckoo Land. And the January prompt for it that came out of the spin was read the book you most want to read. So I just picked the book that I most wanted to read in January and added it to my stack of 12. So this became book number 12 and checked off that prompt. The prompt for February is to read a rainy day book. And I think there are probably only 2 books here that meet that brief. One of them is The List of Suspicious Things by Jenny Godfrey, which looks like it leans into the cozy crime genre, but I've heard it's really good. And the other one is a rare fantasy book for me, or like an Arthurian legend fantasy thing, Lev Grossman's Bright Sword, which would also fulfill like my desire to read more long books. So yeah, we'll see. I think probably I'm going to do the Jenny Godfrey just for time reasons, although it is still quite long. It's like 440 pages, nearly 450 pages. But yes, that's it. That is my wrap up. We are done. I would love to hear from you if you've read any of these books and how you felt about them. Do let me know what you read for the Read Good Challenge in January. I've seen a lot of people taking a lot of liberties with the Annuary prompt, but I don't mind. You play however you want. And do let me know what flame-related book you're looking to read for February and any other challenges that you're doing. I'd like to hear them. If you enjoyed this video, please do hit like because it does genuinely help the channel out. And if you'd like to see more from me, I publish a video about once a week. And if you are subscribed, those will land on your subscriptions feed and probably on your homepage too. So thank you very much for watching. But until next time, toodles.